Welcome back to another journey through history. Today, we begin a story unlike any other. The story of a young woman who would rise from obscurity to become one of the most pivotal figures in World War II. She wasn't born a soldier, she wasn't raised to be a warrior, and yet she became one of the Nazis' most wanted enemies. Her name was Nancy Wake, though the Gestapo had another name for her: the White Mouse. To understand Nancy Wake's extraordinary transformation, we must first return to her beginnings. Born on August 13, 1912 in Wellington, New Zealand, Nancy was the youngest of 6 children in a working-class family. When she was still very young, her family moved to Sydney, Australia. But life wasn't easy. Her father abandoned the family, leaving her mother to raise the children alone in a deeply conservative society where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and dependent. Even as a child, Nancy was anything but silent. She was rebellious, independent, and fiery. She often clashed with authority, hated rules that didn't make sense, and carried within her a restlessness that seemed to demand adventure. She dreamed of escaping the dull, constricting life that seemed mapped out for young women in Australia at the time: marriage, children, and obedience. Nancy wanted more. She wanted freedom, she wanted meaning, and above all, she wanted to see the world. As soon as she could, she broke away. At just 16, she ran away from home, working odd jobs to survive. Eventually, she found work as a nurse, which gave her the first taste of independence, but her hunger for adventure was not satisfied. She saved money, and in 1931, she set out to travel abroad. The journey would change her life forever. Arriving in London in the early 1930s, Nancy began training as a journalist. It was a glamorous, dangerous time in Europe. Fascism was on the rise. Adolf Hitler had just taken control in Germany, and his rhetoric of hatred, conquest, and racial purity was beginning to echo across the continent. As a young journalist, Nancy Wake traveled across Europe, reporting on events that many in the West still refused to take seriously. She witnessed firsthand the rise of Nazi power. One particular assignment took her to Vienna, where she witnessed the cruelty of Nazi gangs dragging Jewish men and women through the streets, beating them, humiliating them, and branding them as outcasts. Nancy never forgot what she saw that day. She later said, "The Nazis were bullies, and one thing I hate is bullies." It was a simple sentence, but behind it burned a fire that would shape the rest of her life. By the mid-1930s, Nancy had become fluent in French and relocated to Paris. It was there she met Henri Fioca, a wealthy French industrialist. They fell in love, and in 1939, on the eve of war, the two were married. For a brief moment, Nancy's life seemed destined for comfort and security, but history had other plans. Just months later, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and the world was plunged into World War II. When France fell to Germany in 1940, Nancy Wake's comfortable life collapsed almost overnight. She watched in horror as Hitler's armies marched through Paris. France was now divided, the north under direct Nazi occupation, the south controlled by the collaborationist Vichy regime. The world she had built with Henri was under siege, and Nancy knew she could not sit quietly while tyranny consumed Europe. At first, her resistance was small. She joined the French resistance by helping smuggle messages, food, and money to underground groups. But she quickly proved herself more daring than most. When Jewish families were desperate to escape, Nancy forged documents and arranged safe passages. When downed Allied pilots needed to get back to Britain, Nancy risked her life guiding them through escape routes. The work was dangerous, and betrayal was always a possibility. But Nancy thrived in danger. Her courage, sharp wit, and quick thinking made her an invaluable asset to the resistance. The Gestapo began to take notice. Rumors spread of a mysterious woman who outsmarted Nazi patrols, slipped through checkpoints, and carried out rescues under the noses of German officers. She was everywhere, yet nowhere. They gave her a name, the White Mouse, because she was impossible to catch. But they were determined. By 1943, Nancy Wake was at the top of the Gestapo's most wanted list, with a price of 5 million francs on her head. The danger was closing in. Nancy's husband, Henri, urged her to go into hiding, but Nancy refused to abandon her work. It was only when the Gestapo's net grew too tight that she made the painful decision to flee France and escape to Britain. What she did not know at the time was that Henri would later be captured by the Gestapo and executed for refusing to give up her whereabouts. Nancy carried the guilt of his death for the rest of her life. In Britain, Nancy Wake joined the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, the secret British organisation created by Winston Churchill to set Europe ablaze. Here, Nancy was trained in espionage, sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and survival. She learned how to handle weapons, how to blow up bridges, how to kill silently, and how to endure the harshest of conditions. By 1944, she was one of the most highly trained female agents in the war. In June 1944, just days before the D-Day landings, Nancy Wake parachuted into central France with orders to coordinate resistance fighters and disrupt German communications. What she accomplished in the months that followed would make her a legend. But that is where our story will continue in the next part. From a rebellious child in New Zealand to one of the most wanted women in Europe, Nancy Wake's journey had only just begun. Her greatest tests of courage and her most dangerous missions were still to come.
When Nancy Wake arrived in Britain, her grief over the loss of her husband and her fury at the Nazis burned brighter than ever. She had seen the cruelty of the Gestapo up close. She had smuggled men and women across borders. She had outwitted countless patrols. And now, she wanted revenge. The British intelligence services knew they had found someone extraordinary. Nancy wasn't just courageous, she was adaptable, resourceful, and fluent in French. These were qualities that made her ideal for one of Winston Churchill's boldest initiatives, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. The SOE was not an ordinary military unit. It was a secretive organization tasked with sabotage, espionage, and supporting resistance movements in Nazi-occupied Europe. Its agents operated in the shadows, behind enemy lines, with no uniforms, no protection, and often no hope of rescue if captured. For most people, the idea of parachuting into enemy territory with only a pistol, a radio, and sheer determination would have been unthinkable. For Nancy Wake, it was exactly what she wanted. Her training began immediately. In the Scottish Highlands, Nancy endured grueling physical tests. She hiked long distances carrying heavy packs, scaled cliffs with ropes, and learned how to survive with minimal supplies. She was trained in unarmed combat, sabotage techniques, and silent killing. She practiced parachute jumps from aircraft, often landing hard in the rocky terrain, then scrambling to her feet to continue the mission. Nancy excelled. Her instructors were astonished by her toughness. Despite her glamorous appearance, dark hair, striking eyes, a confident smile, she was fierce. She could drink her comrades under the table. She could fire every weapon in the arsenal with deadly accuracy. And she had a stamina that few could match. Perhaps her greatest strength, however, was her quick thinking. Nancy had a natural instinct for deception, disguise, and improvisation. If something went wrong, she could adapt instantly. This made her invaluable in the chaos of wartime missions, where plans almost never survived first contact with the enemy. By the spring of 1944, Nancy was ready. The Allies were preparing for the greatest operation of the war, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. To ensure success, resistance movements across France had to be organized, supplied, and coordinated. This was where Nancy came in. She was assigned to support the Maquis, French resistance fighters operating in the rugged mountains of central France. On the night of April 29, 1944, Nancy boarded a bomber plane headed for occupied France. In the darkness, with only the roar of the engines around her, she prepared for her most dangerous journey yet. She was carrying coded messages, weapons, and a vital mission: to unite scattered resistance groups and prepare them for battle. As the plane crossed into enemy territory, Nancy moved to the hatch. Below her stretched the French countryside, bathed in moonlight, crisscrossed by German patrols. Without hesitation, she leapt into the night. The parachute opened with a jolt, and within seconds she was drifting silently toward the earth. When she landed, she picked herself up, brushed off the dirt, and laughed. Later, she would recall the jump with her characteristic wit. "I hit the ground like a sack of potatoes." Waiting for her were local resistance fighters who would become her comrades for the months ahead. They were farmers, villagers, and young men who had taken to the hills to escape conscription or persecution. Poorly armed, lacking training, but determined to fight, the Maquis needed leadership. Nancy gave it to them. Her mission was twofold: to coordinate the delivery of Allied weapons and supplies, and to organize sabotage operations against the Germans. She quickly set to work. Using her radio, she arranged airdrops of guns, explosives, and medical supplies. Night after night, she signaled to Allied aircraft with torches, guiding them to safe landing zones. Soon the mountains were filled with crates of weapons, ready to be used against the occupiers. But Nancy was not just a courier. She was a leader. She joined her men in raids on German supply convoys, ambushes of patrols, and demolition of railways and bridges. She rode a bicycle for more than 300 miles in just 3 days to deliver an urgent message after her radio operator was captured, a feat of endurance that left even hardened resistance fighters in awe. Her courage inspired those around her. Many of the Maquis were skeptical at first of taking orders from a woman, but Nancy silenced their doubts. She proved her worth in every mission, leading from the front, never asking anyone to do something she would not do herself. She was as tough as any man, and in many cases, tougher. The Gestapo, meanwhile, grew increasingly desperate. Reports flooded in of sabotage in central France, of rail lines destroyed, of German troops ambushed, of supply depots blown to pieces. Again and again, witnesses spoke of a dark-haired woman at the center of the action. The Gestapo knew exactly who she was. The price on Nancy Wake's head soared. Yet still, she slipped through their fingers. Her code name was Hélène, but the Germans continued to call her the White Mouse. As June 1944 approached, Nancy's role became even more crucial. The Allies were preparing to land in Normandy. For the invasion to succeed, German reinforcements had to be delayed from reaching the beaches. That meant the Maquis had to strike hard, disrupting railways, sabotaging roads, and attacking supply convoys. Under Nancy's coordination, the resistance launched wave after wave of attacks. Explosions echoed across the countryside as bridges were destroyed, German trains derailed, telephone lines were cut, communications collapsed. The German war machine in France began to stall, giving the Allies the precious time they needed to secure their beachheads. Nancy Wake, the runaway girl from New Zealand, the journalist who had once walked the streets of Vienna, had now become one of the most effective saboteurs in occupied Europe. Her actions saved countless Allied lives, and her leadership turned ragtag fighters into a formidable force. But her story was far from over. In Part 3, we will follow Nancy Wake into the heart of the Maquis uprising, where she commanded thousands of fighters in open battle against German troops, earning her place as one of the most decorated heroines of World War II.
The night skies of June 1944 burned with fire as Allied ships and aircraft unleashed their fury on the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord, the Great Invasion, had begun. But far from the coast, deep in the mountains of central France, another war was being fought. It was a war of sabotage, ambush, and uprising. And at the heart of it all was Nancy Wake. By the time of D-Day, Nancy had helped build a resistance force numbering nearly 7,500 men. They were farmers, students, and villagers, armed now with British-supplied weapons, grenades, and explosives. Under her leadership and that of fellow SOE agents, the Maquis became more than scattered fighters. As the summer of 1944 gave way to autumn, the tide of war in France began to turn decisively in favor of the Allies. Nancy Wake, however, remained in the thick of the struggle. Her work was far from over. Though Allied forces were advancing, German resistance in central France was fierce, and Nancy knew that her mission to disrupt, sabotage, and lead the Maquis was critical to securing permanent liberation. One of her final missions involved coordinating attacks against a heavily fortified German garrison near Montluçon. With a combination of sabotage and ambushes, Nancy and her fighters managed to immobilize key German units, destroy ammunition depots, and cut off retreat routes. Her strategy was bold and daring, often placing herself directly in the line of fire to inspire her men. Witnesses recalled her moving through smoke and rubble, directing attacks with a calm authority that belied the danger around her. During these missions, Nancy also focused on protecting civilians. She often intervened to prevent German reprisals against villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters. Her humanity was as formidable as her courage. She refused to sacrifice innocent lives, even when such decisions carried immense personal risk. By September 1944, Nancy Wake had become a symbol of French resistance. Allied commanders recognized her extraordinary contribution, and she received numerous decorations for bravery. Among them were the George Medal from Britain, the Croix de Guerre from France, and later the Legion of Honor. Yet, despite these accolades, Nancy remained humble. She insisted her actions were simply part of the fight for freedom, attributing her success to the bravery of the men and women who fought alongside her. The liberation of France brought both triumph and sorrow. Nancy's leadership had saved countless lives, but it had come at a cost. Friends and comrades had fallen in battle, and the memory of her husband, Henri, executed by the Gestapo, haunted her. Yet she pressed forward, driven by a sense of duty and the belief that the fight against tyranny could not end until Europe was truly free. After the war, Nancy Wake's fame grew, yet she remained a private figure. She returned briefly to Paris, where she worked with displaced persons and assisted in rebuilding efforts. She later moved to Australia, where she lived quietly, shunning the spotlight even as historians and journalists sought to record her extraordinary story. Her courage and leadership, however, were never forgotten. Nancy's life after the war was marked by reflection, adventure, and quiet heroism. She married again, raised a family, and dedicated herself to helping others, always carrying the lessons of resilience, courage, and justice that had defined her life. Her story serves as a reminder that one determined individual, even a young woman from humble beginnings, can change the course of history.
Today, Nancy Wake's legacy lives on in museums, documentaries, and the memories of those whose lives she touched. She remains a symbol of bravery, intelligence, and defiance in the face of oppression, a true heroine whose story transcends time, inspiring generations to stand against injustice. Her journey, from a rebellious girl in New Zealand to one of the most decorated and feared resistance fighters of World War II, shows the extraordinary impact of courage, determination, and unwavering belief in freedom. Nancy Wake, the White Mouse, will forever remain a pivotal figure in the history of the Second World War.
Even as the Allies pressed forward after the D-Day landings, the fight in central France remained perilous. Nancy Wake and her Maquis fighters faced relentless German counterattacks. Supplies were scarce, the terrain was rugged, and the enemy was brutal and experienced. Yet under Nancy's leadership, the resistance continued to operate with unmatched precision and daring. One of her most famous exploits involved the capture of a German garrison near the town of Montluçon. Leading a force of roughly 700 Maquis fighters, Nancy orchestrated a multi-pronged assault. She personally scouted enemy positions, coordinated ambushes, and directed her fighters from the front lines. The operation was a resounding success. German forces were forced to surrender, prisoners were taken, and vital equipment was captured. Nancy's tactical brilliance had turned what seemed an impossible mission into a victory. Her actions during these months blurred the lines between soldier and spy. She lived constantly on the move, sleeping in forests, barns, or hidden caves, always aware that the Gestapo could be waiting around any corner. One chilling incident occurred when she narrowly escaped a German patrol while carrying critical intelligence. Nancy had disguised herself as a peasant woman, blending into a village market. The Germans passed within meters of her, unaware of the presence of one of Europe's most wanted women. Nancy's daring extended beyond sabotage and espionage. On more than one occasion, she physically rescued Allied soldiers and civilians from certain death. She led downed pilots to safety, navigated them through German-occupied territory, and delivered them to waiting Allied contacts. Her ability to combine courage, tactical skill, and quick thinking made her indispensable to the resistance network. As the months progressed, the Gestapo intensified their pursuit. They implemented roadblocks, interrogated locals, and raided villages. They offered enormous rewards for Nancy Wake's capture. But each attempt to ensnare her ended in failure. The White Mouse was simply too clever, too quick, and too fearless. Her legend grew among both allies and enemies alike. Nancy's contributions were not only military, but also psychological. Her presence inspired the resistance fighters, instilling in them a belief that victory against a seemingly invincible enemy was possible. Her leadership demonstrated that one determined individual could galvanize an entire network of ordinary people to extraordinary acts of courage. By late 1944, as Allied forces liberated much of France, Nancy continued to lead operations against retreating German forces. She ensured that key transportation routes remained disrupted, preventing the Nazis from regrouping. Her relentless energy and tactical expertise were critical in maintaining pressure on enemy forces, ultimately contributing to the speed and success of the Allied advance. Nancy Wake's story during this period is a testament to bravery, ingenuity, and relentless commitment, from orchestrating ambushes to rescuing the vulnerable. She exemplified the highest ideals of resistance in wartime Europe. Each mission she undertook carried immense risk, yet she persisted, driven by a personal and unwavering resolve to defeat tyranny.
As the autumn of 1944 unfolded, France was slowly being liberated, but Nancy Wake's mission was far from over. German forces were retreating, yet they were far from defeated. Scattered units continued to resist, launching surprise attacks, burning villages, and attempting to regroup. Nancy remained on the front lines, coordinating guerrilla operations and ensuring that the Maquis maintained their momentum. During this period, she undertook one of her most daring missions. Intelligence reported a German command post deep in occupied territory. Without hesitation, Nancy led a small team of resistance fighters on a perilous night raid. They navigated treacherous forests and avoided numerous patrols. When they reached the target, the operation was executed with precision. Explosives destroyed the post. Enemy officers were captured, and vital documents were retrieved, providing the Allies with critical intelligence. This was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of months of relentless operations, each one fraught with danger and requiring exceptional courage. Despite constant danger, Nancy also dedicated herself to helping civilians affected by the war. She coordinated the evacuation of families trapped in conflict zones, provided medical assistance when possible, and protected villages from retaliatory attacks by German forces. Her sense of duty extended beyond military objectives. She understood that freedom meant preserving life and dignity, not just defeating the enemy. By early 1945, the Allied advance accelerated. Nancy Wake and the Maquis disrupted remaining German movements, blowing up railways, cutting off retreating convoys, and preventing key supply lines from reaching the front. Her operations significantly hindered the Nazis' ability to mount a coordinated defense, saving countless lives and contributing to the hastening of Germany's defeat. As the war drew to a close, Nancy Wake's remarkable contributions did not go unnoticed. She was awarded the George Medal by Britain for her extraordinary bravery, the Croix de Guerre with multiple citations from France, and later the Legion of Honor, one of France's highest distinctions. Her superiors lauded her not only for her courage and skill, but also for her unwavering leadership under extreme adversity. Yet despite her fame, Nancy remained modest. She credited the success of the resistance to the bravery and dedication of the men and women who fought alongside her. Her stories were filled with accounts of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts, emphasizing collective heroism over personal glory. After the formal liberation of France, Nancy returned briefly to London and Paris, assisting in post-war recovery efforts and helping displaced persons rebuild their lives. She later returned to Australia, her adopted home, where she lived quietly, avoiding the public eye despite international recognition of her heroism. Her post-war life was marked by a blend of reflection and resilience. Nancy never sought fame, but she carried the lessons of courage, determination, and moral conviction throughout her life. She became a symbol of what one determined individual could achieve, inspiring generations to stand against injustice and tyranny. Nancy Wake passed away in 2011 at the age of 98. Today, her legacy endures as one of World War II's most extraordinary stories of bravery, leadership, and resistance. From a rebellious young girl in New Zealand to one of the Allies' most celebrated operatives, Nancy Wake's life exemplifies the impact of courage, intelligence, and unwavering moral resolve in the face of overwhelming adversity. In Part 7, we will delve deeper into personal anecdotes, lesser-known missions, and the untold stories that further highlight Nancy Wake's pivotal role in shaping the outcome of World War II.